Welcome to the adventure of the Adventures Knight, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, the Eastern Enigma. Tales from the Great Hiatus, playing in the year 1893. The world believed my friend Sherlock Holmes dead for 3 long years. Only recently, from a secret compartment in his old travel trunk, have his own journals emerged. After a painstaking effort of decoding his complex cipher, I can now present these accounts of his great hiatus. They form a remarkable chronicle, which I have titled Sherlock Holmes, the Eastern Enigma, wherein the master of logic confronted the ancient mysteries of the Orient. These chronicles begin not in the mountains of Tibet, but in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, with a most peculiar affair involving a chess piece and a death in the Sultan's palace. I have labeled this first decoded manuscript The Adventure of the Sultan's Knight. Chapter 1. It was during the long and weary months of my friend's great hiatus, that period when I believed him lost to the world, that the singular affair of the Sultan's Knight took place. I recount it now as he later related it to me, piecing together the narrative from his own crisp, analytical recollections of a time spent under the assumed identity of one Sigerson, a Norwegian scholar of some repute. He had found himself in Constantinople, that ancient crossroads of empires, a city whose very air seemed thick with whispered secrets. He had chosen a small, shadowed café in the Pera district, a place where the clatter of backgammon pieces from one corner mingled with the low hiss of a samovar in another. The air hung heavy with the sweet perfume of apple tobacco and the bitter aroma of strong coffee. Through the archway, the ceaseless river of humanity flowed. Merchants in their fezzes, veiled women, and European officials, their brisk steps a stark contrast to the city's languid pace. It was amidst this carefully chosen anonymity that a man detached himself from the crowd and approached Holmes's table. The newcomer was of middle height, with clever dark eyes that took in everything at a glance. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, and bowed slightly before speaking. His voice was a low, measured tone, his English precise, yet carrying the faintest cadence of the Levant. Herr Sigerson, I am given to understand you are the foremost European authority on early Byzantine fortifications, remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. An academic curiosity, nothing more. My work is of little interest outside of dusty libraries, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's reply was dry, delivered in the slightly stilted manner he had adopted for his Norwegian persona. The man, who introduced himself as Sarkis Bedrosian, gave a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He slid into the opposite chair without invitation, the legs scraping softly on the tiled floor. Perhaps, but it is said that a man who can discern the hidden weaknesses in a 1,000-year-old wall might also perceive the cracks in a more recent construction. A construction of lies, for instance, responded Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Holmes merely raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady over the rim of his small coffee cup. You speak in riddles, Mr. Bedrosian. I am a simple scholar, deduced Sherlock Holmes, and I am a simple merchant. Yet we both find ourselves in a city where simplicity is a dangerous affectation. A great man has died. Fuad Pasha, a minister of the Sultan's divan. a man of great influence, and, some would say, of great conscience, remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Bedrosian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was almost lost in the cafe's low hum. The minister, you see, was found in his study within the Topkapi Palace itself. The door was bolted from within. On the official record, his heart simply failed him in the night. A peaceful end for a man whose life was anything but, answered Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. A locked room and a natural death. It is a sad but not uncommon story, replied Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, but in his hand, sir, in his hand, he clutched a small ivory chess-piece. A white knight, Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian replied. For the first time, a flicker of genuine interest lit Holmes's grey eyes. The scholar's placid mask slipped for just an instant. He set his cup down with a quiet click. Your concern is not merely for justice, Mr. Bedrosian. The slight fraying on your left cuff suggests a man who deals in ledgers, but the immaculate polish on your boots speaks of a desire to walk in corridors of power. You are a merchant, but you trade in more than silks and spices. You trade in influence. Fuad Pasha's death is not a tragedy to you. It is a disruption to the delicate balance of your commerce. Sherlock Holmes responded. Bedrosian's composure did not break, but a new respect entered his gaze. He nodded slowly. My friends in London chose their consultant well. The official investigation is closed. No one in the palace wishes to look closer, but there are those of us who believe this was not an act of God, but an act of man. A message written with a chess piece instead of a pen. Will you look into this for us, Herr Sigerson? Answered Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Holmes considered the man before him, his long fingers steepled under his chin. The problem was singular, a knot of intrigue tied within the very heart of the Ottoman Empire, a challenge worthy of his powers, a welcome diversion from the tedium of his self-imposed exile. To investigate, I must see the board upon which this game was played. Access to the Topkapi is restricted, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Bedrosian's voice held a note of triumph. It is already arranged. Tomorrow, the palace curator will welcome a most esteemed Norwegian scholar, eager to inspect the famed Byzantine mosaics of the Imperial Council Hall. The very wing where Fuad Pasha had his chambers, replied Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. An invitation had been extended. The first move in a deadly game had been made, and Sherlock Holmes, under the guise of a quiet academic, was about to step into the gilded cage itself. The air within the imperial gate of Topkapi Palace was immediately different from the chaotic bustle of the city we had left behind. The clamour of merchants and the rattle of carriage wheels fell away, replaced by a profound and watchful silence, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of our own boots upon the worn flagstones, and the distant metallic clang of a sentry's halberd. Our guide, Mr. Bedrosian, seemed to shrink into himself, his earlier confidence having vanished, as if consumed by the profound silence of the place. His voice was a low murmur, barely disturbing the quiet. A word of counsel, Herr Sigerson. Here one sees everything and remarks upon nothing. The walls do not merely have ears, they have memories, replied Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Holmes, in his guise as the stooping Norwegian academic, merely nodded, his gaze sweeping across the magnificent Iznik tilework that climbed the walls in a riot of blue and turquoise. He paused, ostensibly to admire the calligraphy above an archway, but I knew his mind was not on art. He was absorbing the very essence of the place, a beautiful, intricate trap. "It is a curious contrast to London, is it not?" he remarked, his tone dry and scholarly. "There, a man with a secret is a solitary figure, his guilt a palpable shadow. Here, conspiracy is the common air they breathe. It is a fog so thick that a single crime becomes indistinguishable from the general miasma of intrigue," replied Sherlock Holmes. "We passed through the second court, where the murmur of human activity returned, though it was a subdued, conspiratorial sound. Courtiers in fine silks and stern-faced officials moved with a silent, gliding purpose, their slippered feet making no sound on the marble. It was a world removed from the forthright villainy of a Limehouse stabbing, or the grasping avarice of a Mayfair theft. This was something else entirely, a game played with poisoned pleasantries and whispers that carried the weight of fate." As we neared the entrance to the inner sanctums, a figure emerged from a shaded portico blocking our path. He was a tall, imposing man in the immaculate uniform of the Sultan's guard, his breast adorned with a single glittering medal. His face was hawkish and intelligent, his black beard trimmed to a severe point. The quiet deference of the passing courtiers marked him instantly as a man of great authority. Bedrosian bowed low, his voice trembling slightly. "Tarik Pasha, an unexpected honor. I am escorting Herr Sigerson, the architectural scholar, who has been granted permission," remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. The man's voice was a deep baritone, calm and resonant, with absolute command. He cut Bedrosian off with a slight, almost imperceptible gesture. "I am aware of Herr Sigerson's visit. The Sultan is a patron of learning." His dark eyes fixed upon Holmes, and they were the sharpest, most analytical I had ever seen, save for my friend's own, said Tarik Pasha. "You are most gracious, Pasha," Holmes replied, his Norwegian accent perfectly measured. "I am particularly keen to study the Kufic inscriptions in the older chambers, a unique blend of Abbasid influence and early Ottoman design," Sherlock Holmes responded. "Indeed," the Pasha said, his lips barely moving. "Our history is written in our stones, but be warned, scholar, some stones are best left unturned." He held Holmes's gaze for a moment longer, a silent contest of wills, before giving a curt nod. "Proceed," answered Tarik Pasha. He stepped aside, and we passed, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny upon my shoulders as if it were a physical burden. When we were a safe distance away, Bedrosian wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. That was Tarik Pasha, head of the Sultan's guard. He was Fuad Pasha's protégé and his greatest rival, a master of the chessboard, they say. Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian answered. Holmes said nothing, but a familiar spark of intense interest kindled in his eyes. The mention of chess, following the clue of the White Knight, was no mere coincidence. It was the first thread of logic I had been able to grasp in this web of silent intrigue. Bedrosian led us towards a smaller, more secluded wing of the palace, the air growing stiller with every step. He stopped before an ornate cedar door, flanked by 2 guards who bowed to his authority. "As requested, Herr Sigerson," he whispered, his task now complete, "for your architectural survey, the private study of the late Fuad Pasha." Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian replied. Our guide, Mr. Bedrosian, paused before a heavy door of carved cedar, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl. A brittle wax seal, stamped with the Sultan's intricate cipher, was affixed over the lock. The air in the corridor was still and heavy, carrying the faint, cloying scent of rosewater and something older, like dust and secrets. A guard, silent as a statue, broke the seal with a ceremonial dagger, the crack of the wax unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, he drew back a thick iron bolt on our side of the door before turning a key. The door swung inwards, revealing not darkness, but a chamber bathed in the soft, hazy light of the Golden Horn. Bedrosian gestured us inside, but did not cross the threshold himself, his expression a mask of prudent neutrality. Holmes, or rather Sigerson, stepped past him without a word, his tall, spare figure seeming to absorb the very atmosphere of the room. I followed, and the door clicked shut behind us, the sound echoing the finality of a tomb. The chamber was opulent yet severe. Rich Persian carpets muffled our footfalls entirely. Divans lined the walls, and the air was thick with the aroma of dried herbs and old leather-bound books. Yet for all its comfort, a palpable chill remained. Holmes paid no mind to the luxurious appointments. His attention was immediately seized by the door through which we had entered. He ran his long, thin fingers along the frame, then knelt to examine the heavy bolt on the interior side. It was of solid brass, deeply set into the wood, and shone where the guard's hand had recently drawn it back. "Observe, my dear fellow, the bolt is sturdy, its housing original. There is no artifice here. It was shot from within." "And the windows?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. He strode to the far wall, where a series of arched windows overlooked the palace gardens. He tested each lattice, finding them not merely locked, but sealed with paint and age. Not a single pane was disturbed. There was no fireplace, no secret panel that my eye could detect, no means of ingress or egress save the one bolted door. "We are presented," he declared, turning back to the center of the room, "with the classic and often most fallacious of puzzles, the sealed chamber. A man dies, bolted in against the world. The world presumes a natural passing or a suicide, but the world is so often a fool." His gaze swept the room, finally coming to rest upon a small ebony table near the center. Upon it sat a chessboard, the pieces set as if in the midst of a game. But it was the board and pieces themselves that drew a flicker of intense interest in my friend's eye. He moved towards it, his usual languor replaced by the sharp, predatory stillness I knew so well. "It is a handsome set," I remarked, attempting to follow his train of thought. Dr. John Watson commented, "Handsome is not the word, Watson. It is incongruous." He did not touch the pieces, but leaned closer, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "This is a Jacques of London Staunton set, boxwood and ebony, weighted with lead. the finest craftsmanship England has to offer, and it is sitting on the desk of Fuad Pasha, Sherlock Holmes said. He straightened up, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. He began to pace the small space between the desk and the divan, his footsteps still making no sound upon the thick carpet. Fuad Pasha, the man who publicly denounced the importation of Western goods as a cultural poison. The minister who insisted his staff use only Ottoman wares. Why, I read a transcript of his speech to the Merchants' Guild not a month ago. He was a purist, a traditionalist. For such a man to possess a chess set of this make is as unlikely as the Archbishop of Canterbury keeping a statue of Vishnu on his mantelpiece. The logic was, as always, inescapable once he had laid it bare. The chess set was not merely a possession. It was a statement, a contradiction of the dead man's entire public life. Therefore, he concluded, stopping his pacing and fixing me with his piercing gaze, it was not a treasured heirloom. It was a recent acquisition, a gift, perhaps, or something more, a message. The game being played here was not on this board, Watson. To solve the riddle of this room, I must understand the purpose of these pieces, and for that, I must get my hands on them again, under the very nose of our watchful friend, Tarik Pasha. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes returned to our temporary lodgings, the scent of the spice market clinging faintly to his coat. I had been pacing for some hours, my nerves frayed by the inactivity, and the quiet click of the key in the lock was a most welcome sound. He entered not with triumph, but with the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who has confirmed a dire diagnosis. He shed his coat, and as he recounted the events of his meeting, his voice was low and measured, painting a picture of the scene for me with meticulous detail. The office of Tarik Pasha, Watson, is a curious paradox. It resides within the ancient labyrinthine heart of the Topkapi, yet it is as modern and severe as any room in Whitehall. There is but one desk, one chair for a visitor, and the man himself, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He described Tarik Pasha as a man whose stillness was more unnerving than any overt threat. He sat behind a vast mahogany desk, his uniform immaculate, his gaze as sharp and polished as the ceremonial dagger at his belt. The only sound in the room was the distant, rhythmic tread of a sentry in the stone corridor beyond the heavy, closed door. I presented myself as Sigerson, the Norwegian scholar, my interest purely academic. I spoke of Byzantine mosaics, of Ottoman calligraphy, and finally of the incongruous English chess set found in the chamber of the late Fuad Pasha. Sherlock Holmes said. My friend had framed his request as a matter of cultural curiosity, an anomaly a man of his supposed field could not ignore. Tarik Pasha listened without a flicker of expression, his fingers steepled before him. After a long silence, punctuated only by the scratching of my friend's pen on his notepad as he pretended to take a note, the Pasha gave a curt nod. He rose, the leather of his boots groaning softly against the polished floor, and unlocked a heavy cabinet against the wall. The state has catalogued the minister's effects. Your interest is unusual, Mr. Sigerson, but you may observe, Tarik Pasha replied. The voice, as Holmes described it, was devoid of warmth, a flat and formal declaration. He placed the Jacques chess set upon his desk. The pieces gleamed under the light from the tall arched window. It was here that Holmes employed his gambit. "Rather than reach for the pieces, Watson, I directed my full attention to the board." "Magnificent!" I exclaimed, my voice filled with contrived academic zeal. "The alternating inlay of rosewood and satinwood, it speaks to a very specific period of English craftsmanship. May I?" Sherlock Holmes noted. As Pasha leaned forward, his gaze drawn to the geometric patterns of the board Holmes indicated, my friend's hand moved with the swift, deceptive grace of a conjurer. He did not seize a piece, but allowed his fingers to brush across them, finally settling upon the white knight as if to steady his hand while he examined the woodwork. For 3 heartbeats it was in my grasp. The deception was total. To Pasha, I was merely an eccentric scholar admiring a detail of the board. But in my palm I felt the truth. The piece was cold, and its weight was utterly wrong, far too dense for ivory. My thumb, trained to detect the most minute of variations, traced its flank and found it, remarked Sherlock Holmes. "Found what, Holmes?" asked Dr. John Watson. "A seam, Watson, a hairline fissure, so perfectly crafted as to be invisible to any eye not precisely searching for it. It was a hollow vessel. Before Pasha's hawk-like gaze could return to my hands, I had replaced it, my posture unchanged, my expression one of simple scholarly admiration," explained Sherlock Holmes. Just as he finished his careful charade, Pasha straightened up, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. A sharp rap on the door from the sentry outside seemed to serve as a pre-arranged signal. "Your time is concluded, Mr. Sigerson. The artifacts must be secured," Tarik Pasha replied. The dismissal was absolute. He had given a slight bow and departed, the heavy office door closing behind him with a sound of profound finality. Now, standing before me, the analytical light once more gleamed in his eyes. He had his clue. The White Knight is the key. It is a container. But what it contained and how it was delivered remains the question. I have studied the artifact. Now I must study the man. I must understand the mind of the player who moved it, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes later recounted to me, with a glimmer of professional appreciation in his eyes, the particulars of his interview with the formidable Tarik Pasha. He was shown not into some opulent chamber of state, but into a Spartan office that bespoke the man's character. A room of sharp lines, polished dark wood, and disciplined order. The only sounds were the distant rhythmic stamp of sentries' boots on the courtyard stones, and the dry scratch of Holmes's own pen as he feigned taking a note upon his entrance. "Your reputation precedes you, Herr Sigerson. A scholar of the Byzantine is a rare thing in these modern times. Tell me, what is your assessment of the porphyry columns of the Augustaion? Some believe their provenance to be Egyptian, not Roman," Tarik Pasha said. Pasha's voice was as neat and devoid of ornament as his office, a level, quiet baritone that carried an unmistakable edge of command. He did not rise, but watched Holmes from across his great desk, his fingers steepled. It was, as Holmes explained, not a question but a challenge, a precisely calibrated probe to test the depth of his knowledge. An interesting theory, Pasha, but one which ignores the tooling marks near the base, consistent with 2nd century Nicomedean stonemasons. The Egyptians favored a polishing technique that left no such signature. The material may be from the East, but the craftsmanship is wholly of the Empire, observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes delivered the reply in the dry, slightly pedantic tone of the academic he purported to be. A flicker of respect, or perhaps annoyance, crossed the Pasha's features before vanishing. He shifted his line of attack. Indeed, you have a keen eye. Such details are what separate the true expert from the enthusiast. One must be vigilant against imposture in all its forms, responded Tarik Pasha. A sentiment I heartily endorse. It is the foundation of all security, is it not? Your own systems here are a marvel of the old world, but I am curious. Do you study the new? The anthropometric methods of Bertillon in Paris, for instance. A fascinating approach to ensuring a man is who he claims to be, stated Sherlock Holmes. With this, my friend deftly turned the interrogation back upon his inquisitor. The focus shifted from ancient stones to modern men. Pasha's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, the creak of his leather chair the only sign of his reaction. We have our own methods, Herr Sigerson. They are sufficient. The West measures a man's bones. We prefer to measure his loyalties, said Tarik Pasha. A more complex metric, certainly. It requires a profound understanding of the individual. Such an insight as one might gain over a chessboard, perhaps. I understand the late minister, Fuad Bey, was a keen player. A mind that enjoys strategy must have sought a worthy opponent, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The air in the room grew still. Holmes had placed his piece upon the board and now waited for his opponent's move. The distant sound of the sentries seemed to fade, leaving only the charged silence between the two men. Fuad Bey and I shared many games. His grasp of the Sicilian defence was admirable, if predictable. I trust your architectural survey will be concluded shortly, said Tarik Pasha. The dismissal was polite, yet as final as a closing door. Holmes had the fact he needed, a confirmation delivered with chilling composure. He knew now who had sat opposite the dead man, moving the pieces in a game far more final than chess. This knowledge, however, was a dangerous fragment, a single clue in a cipher of immense political complexity. It was this realization, he told me, that made his next appointment with the merchant, Mr. Bedrosian, an absolute necessity. Holmes returned to our lodgings well past midnight. The usual sharp tap of his boot heel was absent, replaced by a quiet, cat-like tread that spoke of a mind entirely consumed. He shed his heavy travelling coat, its fabric clinging with the scent of exotic spices and oiled wool, and stood for a long moment staring into the embers of our dying fire before he turned to me. The merchant, Bedrosian, is a man who walks upon a bridge of his own making, Watson. He has provided the context, though I suspect he has painted it in colours that best suit his own gallery, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He then proceeded to recount, with that astonishing clarity of recall that was his alone, the substance of his clandestine meeting. As he spoke, in my mind's eye, I could see it all. A small, windowless room, tucked away behind a tapestry of rich Persian design in the labyrinthine heart of the Grand Bazaar. The air, he said, was thick with cardamom and ancient paper. while the ceaseless hubbub of the market outside softened to a distant rhythmic murmur, the very heartbeat of the city. A single oil lamp cast long dancing shadows, illuminating the sharp, intelligent features of Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian, an Armenian merchant whose eyes held the weary shrewdness of a man who has survived by his wits alone. He had poured 2 small glasses of a thick, sweet coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls into the lamplight. "You understand, Mr. Sigerson, that Fuad Pasha was not merely a minister. He was the linchpin. The British railway contract, a gateway for your commerce from Scutari to Baghdad, rested entirely upon his influence," remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Bedrosian's voice, Holmes noted, was a soft, measured baritone, each word chosen with the care of a jeweller placing a stone. "His death, so convenient, has thrown the entire enterprise into chaos. The German interests, led by the ambitious Baron von Hessler, are already circling. They have long sought to disrupt this British venture, and now the door is open for them." Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian replied, "A convenient death for Germany, then, and for this baron?" observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes told me he had kept his own voice low and academic, the persona of Sigerson firmly in place. "One might surmise as much. The baron is a man of direct methods. But in the Sultan's court, directness is a clumsy tool. No, this was a thing of subtlety, a whisper, not a shout," responded Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. It was then that Holmes introduced the subject that had truly brought him there, inquiring about Fuad Pasha's personal effects, his habits, and, most pointedly, the English chess set found upon his table. "Ah, the chess set. A beautiful thing, of Staunton design, is it not? A recent acquisition. It was a gift, you see," responded Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. "A gift? From whom?" explained Sherlock Holmes. Bedrosian had paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee, his dark eyes glittering over the rim of the tiny cup. The merchant's timing, Holmes noted, was impeccable. From his most constant opponent and dearest friend, a man who valued their games above all else. It was a gift from Tarik Pasha, the head of the Sultan's guard, answered Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Having concluded his tale, Holmes fell silent. From his waistcoat pocket he retrieved the small, intricately carved white knight he had been permitted to examine, placing it upon the mantelpiece. It stood alone, a solitary ivory soldier against the dark wood. The fire had collapsed into a bed of glowing coals, and the only sound was the distant cry of a waterman from the Bosphorus. A gift from a friend, a convenient death for a rival, and a game left unfinished. Bedrosian has given us the board, Watson, and pointed to the German queen. But I suspect the most dangerous piece is the one we hold in our hand, Sherlock Holmes responded. He fixed his gaze upon the white knight, his brow furrowed in that intense concentration I knew so well. He perceived something in that inanimate piece of carved ivory that was invisible to me, a secret locked within its form, waiting for the precise application of logic to spring it open. Holmes later recounted to me, with that curious, detached clarity he reserved for his most intricate deductions, the hours that followed Mr. Bedrosian's departure. I was not with him in Constantinople, yet his description was so vivid that I can picture him now, seated in the fading light of his modest rooms, the scent of strong coffee and Turkish tobacco hanging in the air. The merchant's words, a tapestry of half-truths and subtle provocations, had left a silence that was, for my friend, more stimulating than any company. For a long while he sat motionless, his steepled fingers pressed to his lips. Then, with the sudden pouncing energy of a cat, he was at his writing desk. He drew forth a sheet of foolscap and a finely sharpened pencil. The distant, mournful call of a muezzin echoed from a nearby minaret, but Holmes was deaf to it. His world had shrunk to the memory of a single, carved piece of ivory. He told me he spoke his thoughts aloud, a habit he indulged when alone and on the scent. "The White Knight," he murmured, his voice a low hum of concentration. "Consider it, Watson, as if it were in your hand." Bedrosian confirmed it was part of a set from London, a gift from Tarik Pasha. Yet when I handled it, its weight felt incongruous, a fraction too heavy at the base, and not with the solid density of ivory, but with the dead weight of lead or steel, stated Sherlock Holmes. The only sound in the room was the fierce, dry scratching of his pencil as it flew across the paper, a sound of formidable precision. "Observe, Watson," he continued, his pencil never ceasing its movement. "I draw it now in cross-section. Here is the hollowed-out cavity, cunningly concealed. And here a seam, so fine as to be almost invisible, running along the moulding of the base. It suggests a lid. Now why? To hide a message? Too clumsy. To add weight? The execution is too complex. No, this is not a vessel. It is a machine." His pencil scratched on, sketching the interior workings with swift, certain strokes. Then he rapped his knuckles sharply on the wooden desk, a sudden, hard crack in the stillness. "There, that is the motion. Inside the cavity, a pressure plate at the base. Connected to it, a tiny spring and a single hair-fine needle poised to emerge from the knight's chest. A player, in a moment of distraction, drums the captured piece upon the table. That small impact depresses the plate, releases the spring, and drives the poisoned needle into the thumb. A minute wound, a fast-acting toxin, a perfect, silent, and most damnable murder, Watson, Sherlock Holmes said. He rose and began to pace, the floorboards groaning a soft protest with each turn. The logic of the device was one thing, its origin was another, and in that he saw the true artistry of the crime. The craftsmanship is not of this city. The mechanism is too fine, the steel of the spring too well-tempered. This is the work of a London specialist, a surgical instrument maker, perhaps, or a gunsmith. Tarik Pasha, with his English military education and his contacts amongst our arms suppliers, would know precisely where to procure such a thing. He commissions an English-made weapon to assassinate a pro-British minister, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He came to a halt before the window, his tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against the deep purple of the Bosphorus sky. The pieces of the political game were now falling into place as surely as the mechanical ones had. Mr. Bedrosian would have me chase this pro-German faction as a convenient scapegoat. But the true gambit is far more subtle. Tarik Pasha uses a British weapon to create an insoluble diplomatic incident. The British are blamed, the railway deal collapses, and his own power is secured. The White Knight does not merely take a pawn, it checkmates an entire foreign policy. A profound silence fell once more. The theory was complete, elegant, and terrifying. Yet it was constructed entirely from memory and inference. It lacked the final anchoring fact. The theory of the machine is useless without the theory of the man. I must know Fuad Pasha's habits. A nervous tic, a moment of agitation, a habit of drumming his captured pieces. That is the key. To find it, I must return to the palace. I must observe, I must listen, and I must find someone within those fearful walls who will dare to speak the truth, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Moving through Topkapi's gardens, one felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Though Mr. Bedrosian guided us with the quiet confidence of a man familiar with its labyrinthine paths, a palpable tension hung in the air, as heavy and cloying as the scent of jasmine. The scrape of a gardener's trowel against stone seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and more than once I saw the flash of a robe as a servant slipped into the shadows of a cypress-lined colonnade upon our approach. His voice, a low murmur, barely disturbed the quiet. They are Tarik Pasha's ears. Every man here owes his position and perhaps his life to the captain of the guard. They will not speak of Fuad Pasha's death, remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Fear, my dear Bedrosian, is a lock, Holmes replied, his gaze sweeping over a meticulously pruned rose bush. But every lock has its key. One does not simply force it with a crowbar of direct questions. One must find the tumblers, Sherlock Holmes noted. His method, as ever, was a study in the oblique. Posing as the Norwegian academic, he paused to compliment an elderly gardener on the vibrant hue of his damask roses, inquiring after the precise composition of the soil. The man, initially terrified, relaxed enough to speak of his craft, though his eyes darted constantly towards the palace walls. Later, in the outer kitchens, the air thick with the aroma of cumin and roasting lamb, Holmes engaged a cook in a brief but learned discussion on the relative merits of spices arriving from Alexandria versus those from the Persian trade routes. In each instance, he gathered nothing of substance regarding our case, yet I could see he was mapping the geography of fear within these walls, testing its boundaries. A fascinating lecture on horticulture, Mr. Sigerson, Bedrosian stated with a dry edge to his tone. But our time is not unlimited, remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. Patience, I am merely listening to the silence. It is telling me who is most afraid, and therefore who is most likely to possess a secret worth keeping, observed Sherlock Holmes. His search led us at last to a secluded alcove near the administrative offices, where a young man polished a silver tray with frantic, inefficient movements. His knuckles were white, his face pale. He was Fuad Pasha's former aide, a youth named Yusuf. Holmes approached not with a question, but with a statement, his voice soft and sympathetic. The Pasha was a great lover of chess, a difficult man to defeat, I am told. He must have been a demanding master to serve. The boy started, nearly dropping the tray, which sent a soft clatter echoing in the stone corridor. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. Bedrosian took a step forward, but Holmes raised a hand, a silent command to remain still. He pitched his voice lower still, a conspiratorial whisper that invited confidence. A man under such pressure develops habits, small rituals to soothe the mind. Tell me, Yusuf, when the game was tense, what was his habit? The aide swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on some distant point of memory. A faint tremor ran through his voice as he finally spoke, the words emerging in a hushed torrent, as if their release might save him. The pieces. When he captured an opponent's piece, he would not set it aside, not at first. He would hold it, and if the game was difficult, he would drum it upon the table, a nervous gesture, just a quiet little rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Over and over, his fingers drumming the captured piece against the polished wood. Yusuf answered. The boy fell silent, as if horrified by his own admission. I glanced at Holmes. His eyes were alight with a fearsome intensity, the look of a man who has just seen the final piece of an intricate puzzle fall perfectly into place. He gave the terrified aide a single reassuring nod before turning away, his long strides carrying us swiftly back towards the gardens. The distant sound of a fountain splashing into its basin seemed to mimic the very rhythm the boy had described. A man's habit, he murmured, more to himself than to me, his voice sharp with the thrill of discovery. The one predictable action in a sea of variables, drumming a captured piece upon his desk. Watson, we have him, observed Sherlock Holmes. We return to our temporary lodgings in Pera as the last call to prayer echoed faintly from the minarets across the Golden Horn. The air, thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and foreign spices, did little to lift the oppressive weight of our discoveries. I lit an oil lamp, its soft glow pushing back against the encroaching twilight, and found Holmes standing by the latticed window, his tall, gaunt frame a silhouette against the deep purple of the evening sky. He had not spoken a word since we had left the palace, lost in that profound internal concentration which I knew so well to be the prelude to a revelation. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of a passing carriage on the cobblestones below. At last Holmes turned, his grey eyes alight with a feverish energy that I had not seen since our arrival in this city of shadows and whispers. His voice was low, yet it seemed to fill the entire space, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It is the habit, Watson, the simple, nervous, repetitive habit. And upon that seemingly trivial detail, the entire edifice of this audacious crime is built, stated Sherlock Holmes. He began to pace, his long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. He was no longer Sigerson, the Norwegian scholar, but Sherlock Holmes, the master of his craft, weaving together the disparate threads of a deadly tapestry. Think of it. We are told by that terrified aide that Fuad Pasha had a peculiar tic. When he captured an opponent's piece, he would not set it aside. No, he would place it beside the board and drum his fingers upon its head, a small, triumphant rhythm. Tap, 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 an unconscious celebration of a minor victory. A strange custom, certainly, I conceded. "But I fail to see how it leads to murder," remarked Dr. John Watson. "Because, my dear Watson, the murderer did not merely know this habit, he weaponized it. He engineered the entire affair to depend upon it. The white knight was not placed in the victim's hand post-mortem. It was the very instrument of death. It was the last piece Fuad Pasha captured. Imagine the scene. The game concludes. In his moment of private satisfaction, Fuad takes the captured knight and begins his drumming. The first tap does nothing, nor the second, but the third, or perhaps the fourth, provides sufficient pressure to depress a cunningly wrought mechanism within its base. A needle springs into his palm, Watson, finer than a hornet's sting. It is coated in a swift, untraceable poison, derived from the venom of some damnable Levantine serpent. A minute puncture, a brief moment of confusion, and then oblivion. The sheer, cold-blooded ingenuity of the scheme left me speechless. It was a murder weapon that armed itself and was triggered by the victim himself. Holmes ceased his pacing and returned to the window. For a long moment he was silent, his gaze sweeping over the glittering lights of the ancient city, as if searching for an answer in their myriad patterns. His tone softened, becoming more reflective, imbued with a strange melancholy. "Do you not see, Watson? This is more than the mere removal of a single man. Fuad Pasha, with his British sympathies, was a pawn advancing dangerously into the Sultan's back rank, threatening to become a queen. His death was not an act of passion, but of cold geopolitical strategy. It is a move in that great game, played out on a board that stretches from Whitehall to the Hindu Kush. Tarik Pasha sees himself as the protector of his empire, and in this game he has sacrificed his opponent's knight with one of his own. A perfidious, brilliant, and deeply symbolic move," replied Sherlock Holmes. The puzzle was complete. The motive, the method, and the man were now as clear to me as the lamp on the table. But Holmes was not finished. He turned from the window, his face set like granite, the hunter's glint back in his eyes. "Proof? There is no proof that would hold in any court, least of all here. The mechanism is destroyed, the poison dissipated. One cannot simply accuse a man like Tarik Pasha. No, this affair began over a chessboard, and it is there it must end." Sherlock Holmes. He looked at me, a thin, grim smile touching his lips. It was a look that promised a confrontation of intellects, a final, silent battle where every move would be a word, and checkmate would be the only confession. "Tomorrow, Watson, I shall request an audience. Mr. Sigerson, it seems, wishes to challenge the head of the Sultan's guard to a friendly game of chess," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes returned to our lodgings long after the evening call to prayer had faded. There was a dangerous light in his grey eyes, a look of keen and terrible satisfaction I recognized as the prelude to a final checkmate. The persona of the Norwegian scholar had vanished. The hawk-like intensity of the Baker Street detective was once more in full command. "You have seen him, then, Tarik Pasha?" Dr. John Watson said. He nodded, pacing our small room, the floorboards groaning under his restless stride. He did not answer directly, but began to speak in that low, measured tone he reserved for unravelling the most intricate of problems. Imagine, Watson, a room designed for conspiracy. Heavy Persian carpets and thick wall hangings consumed every echo, creating a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. In the center of this vacuum stood a single table of polished ebony, and upon it a chessboard of ivory and onyx, stated Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his gaze fixed upon some distant point, as if replaying the scene within the theatre of his mind. Tarik Pasha was already there, a man carved from granite, betraying nothing. I requested one final game, a courtesy, I suggested, before my departure. His pride, Watson, is his most formidable and yet most vulnerable defence. He could not refuse, remarked Sherlock Holmes. I listened, utterly captivated, as Holmes painted the picture of the silent duel that had ensued. It was a battle fought not with words, but with the sharp, decisive click of ivory upon stone. Each sound a gunshot in the oppressive stillness. We played without a single word. I watched his hand, not the board. At first it was as steady as a surgeon's. But I was not playing a new game, you see. I was recreating an old one, maneuvering my pieces into the exact configuration from the dead minister's photograph, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes stopped his pacing and looked directly at me, his expression grim. I began with the Queen's gambit declined, his victim's preferred opening. Move by move, I forced him to relive his crime. I saw the first flicker of recognition as my bishop claimed upon, mirroring the first step of the trap, a tightening of the jaw. Then, as I advanced my knight to that fatal square, a single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. His breathing, once perfectly even, became a shallow, ragged thing, stated Sherlock Holmes. He held up his own hand, long and steady, to demonstrate. The final move was mine. I picked up the white knight, the very piece clutched in his victim's hand. I held it for a moment, then placed it with a soft, deliberate tap upon the board. The click echoed in that dead air. I did not look at the board. I looked only at him. His composure shattered. His hand, reaching for his rook, trembled so violently the piece slipped from his fingers and fell to the carpet with a muffled thud, stated Sherlock Holmes. A stark silence fell between us, mirroring the one Holmes had just described. The tension was palpable. He did not speak. He simply stared at the knight, the instrument of his victory and the symbol of his undoing. The game was won, Watson. He knows that I know. All that remains is to narrate the story of how the match was played. Holmes later described to me the profound silence that followed his final move, a stillness so absolute within that soundproofed chamber that the very beat of a man's heart might seem an intrusion. The chessboard between them was a perfect mirror of a dead man's last moments. Tarik Pasha's face, which had been a mask of disciplined composure, was now as pale as the ivory queen he had just lost. His hands rested motionless on the arms of his chair. It was then that Holmes broke the suffocating quiet. His voice, he told me, was not one of accusation, but rather the dispassionate cadence of a historian recounting a sequence of events. "Permit me to relate a story, Pasha, a hypothetical, of course. It concerns a patriot of immense intellect and influence, a man who sees his ancient empire threatened not by armies, but by the slow, insidious creep of foreign interests. He watches a trusted minister, a man he respects, grow weak and susceptible to the whispers of Western ambassadors, their promises like gilded poison, explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, his eyes fixed on the Pasha, who remained utterly still. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a carriage clock somewhere beyond the heavy draperies. This patriot, a student of both politics and poison, devises a plan of exquisite precision. He commissions a weapon, not a clumsy firearm, but something more elegant. A single hollow needle, finer than a tailor's, filled with a fast-acting alkaloid derived from the calabar bean, a substance that paralyzes the heart but leaves almost no trace. He has this needle mounted within the base of a white knight, the very piece he knows his opponent favors, and one which the man has a nervous habit of tapping upon the board when deep in thought, replied Sherlock Holmes. He saw a flicker in Pasha's eyes, the barest acknowledgment of a truth delivered with surgical accuracy. Holmes pressed his intellectual advantage, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word carried the weight of a hammer blow. The game is arranged. The moment arrives. The minister, contemplating a difficult move, taps the knight. A minute prick, scarcely felt. A moment later he slumps, his hand clutching the instrument of his own demise. To any physician it appears a simple failure of the heart, a quiet end to a game. But the patriot's message is sent. And yet one puzzle remains: how to achieve this in a chamber bolted from the inside, replied Sherlock Holmes. This was the crux of it, the master stroke of the deduction. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his long fingers gesturing towards the ornate fretwork on the ceiling above the gaming table. The solution, you see, is as brilliant as the murder itself. A length of wire, no thicker than a spider's thread, is passed through a minuscule hole drilled in the ceiling above. It is attached to a tiny, spring-loaded catch within the knight. From an adjoining servants' passage, an accomplice retracts the needle once the deed is done, rendering the weapon inert. The chamber remains locked, and the patriot is safe? A perfect and seemingly insoluble crime, replied Sherlock Holmes. The story was finished. The hypothesis hung in the air, a complete and unassailable edifice of logic. Tarik Pasha did not speak. He did not deny. He simply stared at the board, at the replica of the game that had sealed two men's fates. His jaw was set like granite. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of utter and absolute defeat, his hand moved across the board. It was not to make a move, but to surrender the entire war. His fingers closed around the neck of his own king. A single, soft clatter of ivory against polished wood was Holmes's only reply. It was the sound of a confession, an abdication, and an execution, all in one. We met Mr. Bedrosian for the last time in a cavernous warehouse by the Golden Horn. The air, thick with the scent of cloves and damp jute, did little to mask the underlying tang of salt and sea. Above our heads, motes of dust danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom. and from without came the rhythmic sigh of water lapping against the pier, punctuated by the lonely cry of a gull. The merchant emerged from behind a tall stack of crates, his face a mask of anxious inquiry in the dim light. "Mr. Sigerson, you have returned. Is the matter concluded?" said Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. "The game is indeed concluded, Mr. Bedrosian. The checkmate has been delivered," stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's voice was calm and devoid of triumph, the simple statement of a fact. Bedrosian took a half-step forward, his relief warring with a clear thread of suspicion. "And the player, Tarik Pasha, will he face the Sultan's justice for his crime?" remarked Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. "He has faced a justice of a different sort. The threat he posed to your interests and to those of your British patrons is extinguished. The Pasha remains in his post, a lion with its claws drawn, but a lion nonetheless. The board is stable," declared Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of disbelief crossed the merchant's features. He had clearly anticipated a more tangible, more public form of retribution. Stable, but not clean. "I confess I had hoped for a more definitive result," answered Mr. Sarkis Bedrosian. "A definitive result, as you call it, would have sent a tremor through the court. It would have created a vacuum, and nature, particularly political nature, abhors a vacuum. This way, a lesson has been delivered in silence. The checkmate was heard by only one man. That is sufficient," Sherlock Holmes said. Bedrosian gave a slow, reluctant nod. He was a man who understood the intricate dance of power in this city, and though the outcome was not what he had wished for, he could not deny its cold strategic logic. He bowed slightly, and without another word melted back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving Holmes and I alone with the sound of the sea. It was an hour later, as the churning of the screw became a steady pulse beneath our feet, that we stood upon the deck of a steamer pulling away from the shore. It was then that Holmes, casting off the last vestiges of the Norwegian Sigerson, turned to me. "Here, Watson, justice is not a sword, but a scale. In London we hunt a man, we bring him to the dock, and the law, a thing of ledgers and precedents, declares him guilty. The account is settled with a prison cell or a rope. It is clean. It is simple," stated Sherlock Holmes. He spoke not with disdain for our methods at home, but with the quiet, almost reverent tone of a man who has discovered a new and startling specimen. He gestured towards the receding shoreline, a silhouette against the grey light of dawn. But here, in the shadow of the sublime port, the death of one man is weighed against the stability of an empire. To expose Tarik Pasha would be to solve one problem by creating a dozen more, deduced Sherlock Holmes. I considered his words as the great dome of the Hagia Sophia dwindled behind us. It was a chilling calculus, one that placed the gears of state above the life of an individual. My task was not to punish a murderer, but to restore the very balance he sought to protect in his own brutal fashion. The White Knight is back in its box. That is the victory, explained Sherlock Holmes. As our vessel cut a path through the Bosphorus, I watched my friend at the rail. He was not looking back at the receding domes and minarets of that ancient city, but out towards the open sea, towards the future. The great Hiatus had done more than save him from Moriarty's agents. It had shown him a world of problems whose solutions could not be found in a test tube or a criminal index. He had left London a master of logic, but I felt he was returning a philosopher of consequence.